woman was the final creation of the Lord. And I would say that as the final creation, it's his greatest expression of his creativity. A woman is sort of the crowning achievement, the crown of all creation. And I think a lot of women don't understand that or don't appreciate that, don't function out of that, because that crown, coming with that crown, is a special glory that's theirs and theirs. And the second thing is, in the Hebrew, it says he formed Adam, but he fashioned Eve. It's a different Hebrew word. And the Hebrew word for fashioning is more complex, more intentional, more construction, more going on, which in one sense you'd say, well, that makes a lot of sense. It's easier to work with a malleable piece of clay than a rigid piece of calcium. But I think as God was fashioning Eve to present her to Adam, he was thinking downrange of the time when he'll present the church to the second Adam. And so that's another unique glory that woman has as being a representation of the bride of Christ.
I had a conversation with Mr. John Bishop. John is a friend that we met in Washington, who I asked come on my podcast. I didn't know much about John except for that he had been to the Vietnam War, and that now he is a very solid guy and we can always depend on him. He meets us at the airport. Sits down to dinner with us. He's a lovely friend, and he has lots of knowledge, a life of knowledge that I wanted to share with you. And so that's what you're going to see. Thanks for joining. Hi, John.
Hi, Tammy. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks for agreeing to come on my podcast.
Oh, for sure.
So I'm going to start out by just telling my audience who you are, briefly. Okay?
Sure.
You sent me a little bio. John is a registered representative with Patrick Capital Markets and has over 40 years of sales and capital markets experience. He spent the majority of his career as the Senior Vice President of Sales for CNL Investment Company, where he was instrumental in growing the firm's private placement and real estate investment trust business. John is a 1965 graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy and was commissioned in the U.S. Marine Corps following graduation. He served with the 3rd Marine Division in Vietnam. Now, I think it might be interesting to help the audience know who you are, just to start back when you were young.
Okay.
Kind of go through where you were and what was going on and what was instrumental in who you became.
Okay. Well, I grew up in Kansas City, Kansas. And then in 1960, I was a senior in high school, and my dad went over with a heart attack. And we were a low-income family at best, so college was always iffy to start with. But when he died, it became it just went away as an option altogether. So, like a lot of young men at that time, I enlisted in the Navy to serve. Back then, we were only 15 years out of World War II and 8 years out of Korea, so there was still a lot of young men going into service to serve. But I also went in to get access to the GI Bill, because that became my only source of hope for getting a college education. So I took off for San Diego and was out there, and 2 things happened when I was going through boot camp. Back in those days, chapel was mandatory for sailors. So every Sunday, they'd form up 3,000 recruits and march us over this big auditorium. And the Navy chaplains who were active duty at that time were evangelicals. So every Sunday, I heard the gospel. And one Sunday, it just clicked. It just made sense. So I got up and went forward, and that's where my journey of faith began.
How long was it after you arrived that happened?
I got there in the middle of June, and this happened in the middle of July, mid to late July.
Oh, and had you had any, had you gone to church as a young boy?
My family was, we lived across the street from, it was called Chelsea Christian Church, and my dad never went to church. My mom sort of made us go, and once in a while she would go. So there was some influence there when I was a young child. We'd go to vacation Bible school in the summer because that was a fun thing to do. But there
Yeah.
wasn't any real serious commitment to following the Lord as I learned to do later. But so it was there in boot camp that I came to faith. That's where my journey with Jesus began. And then the second thing that happened was um, I got picked out of the crowd of recruits to be the battalion yeoman or clerk, and because I could type, that was an unusual thing for a young man back in those days. And one day I'm sitting there clerking for the battalion officer, and he looked over and said, "Bishop," he said, "I think you ought to go to the Naval Academy." I said, "Sir, I'm from Kansas. I don't know anything about that. I know about West Point because Eisenhower was a West Point graduate, so it was a favorite son. So everybody in Kansas knew about West Point." He said, "No, I think you ought to go to the Naval Academy." And this battalion officer mentored me all the way through the process to the point where I could get an appointment to the academy. So it's just that's I'm looking back, and it's taken me years to be able to see this. That was the hand of the Lord guiding me before I even knew where first base was in this thing called the Christian life. And I wound up going to the academy and graduating in 1965. And because one of the reasons I didn't go in the Navy is I get seasick, so I didn't want to be aboard
Oh,
ship. So I opted for the Marine Corps, and that was January of 1995 when I made that decision. And then 3 months later, in March of January of '65, then in March of '65, the Marines landed in Da Nang, and so all of us graduates who had selected the Marine Corps, we were pulled together, and the senior Marine advice, we're all that's where we're all going. And sure enough, I graduated in June, landed there in April. I'd already lost one classmate, and we had others lost as flyers, bombing North Vietnam and stuff. So that's where all this kind of came became clearer to me that the spiritual warfare and physical warfare match each other. The principles are the same. It's divide and conquer always works, and deception and lies and those kind of things always work in either war. And I didn't appreciate that or didn't come to realize this until 40 years later. In 2007, I went back to Vietnam on a historical tour with about 35 other Marines. And we went to all the places where we'd served during the war. And I'm on the bus riding over to Quezon, which was the bloodiest part of the war for the Marine Corps. And it was a sober time. I thought of guys, buddies that were lost and the experiences and the circumstances there. And and I began to realize this poor kid from Kansas getting into the Naval Academy, that's a miracle. And I began to see these things, and I just said, Lord, I'd blown this off. I'd never paid attention to it. It never really been part of my modern day thinking. And so I just asked the question, what's this all about? What do I do with this in these later years? And I'm not one of those folks that can say I audibly hear the Lord. I haven't had that experience that I know of. But I had this really strong thought go through my mind, and it was this: that those days are for these days. And so I've interpreted that to mean that the things, my education and the experiences were were for that time for sure, but they were really meant for this time. And so I've been working hard for the last, well, since 2007, of developing an understanding of this reality of spiritual warfare, what we're involved in, and our call to be a part of it in this cosmic battle between good and evil. So,
and how do you see that playing out in this day?
well, there's a couple of passages of scripture that I think need to be linked together.
Hmm.
Ephesians 6, Paul tells us to put on the whole armor of God, but he says we wrestle not against flesh and blood. These are principalities, these are powers, these are in the unseen world. And then in 2 Corinthians 10, he says, the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but they're mighty. In other words, the weapons that we have are not physical weapons like you would normally think of it in a regular war. They're spiritual weapons. They're the weapons for this unseen world. So what I've done is I've created a definition of weapon to try to help folks understand what I think Paul is saying in those two passages. So here's my definition. A weapon is anything you can use that destroys your enemy's ability to wage war against you. So that's a weapon. So when you come into this spiritual battle, forgiveness becomes a weapon. And you've probably never heard forgiveness, articulated as a weapon, but that's exactly what it is. Because when we forgive, we destroy Satan's ability to wage war against us through anger and bitterness and revenge and alienation and hostility. We take the fight to him when we forgive. And that's one of the most powerful weapons we have in our whole arsenal. That's what Jesus came to do, and he sacrificed on the cross so that we could be forgiven. Uh,
How have you seen that happen in your life?
well,
Or have you seen that?
I've got a couple of specific incidences of where I've been hurt by other people, and
Mm-hmm.
I recognized it, but not immediately. It took quite a while for me to process this until I got to the point where, wait a minute, I I need to forgive. Period. Regardless of who's at fault, regardless of who did what, I have to forgive. And so I went through a process, a very specific process of forgiving these people, reconciling with them to the degree that I could, and never asking them or confronting them on their need to seek my forgiveness. I just wanted to be, because Jesus is clear. He says, if you don't forgive, I won't forgive. So I just said, I'm going to forgive and and heal the relationship to the degree that I can, and not lay any responsibility on them to do likewise. And so I've gone through that process, and I just came out of that, and it was liberating. It was freeing. I sleep well at night over those circumstances because my conscience is clear, and I've just made a determination that I will not be unforgiving towards anybody over anything for any reason. It's just not worth it to do that.
Now, these people that you forgave, have you been in contact with them since?
Yes, all of them.
And have they changed at all? Has your relationship changed, do you think, in a consequence of what you've done?
Of the three, one acknowledged and sought my forgiveness on his own
Mm-hmm.
without any prompting from me, recognized on his own that there had been culpability on his part and he needed forgiveness, and that re-cemented the relationship. The other two have never really come back and said, well, I too was wrong, or I did this, or no responsibility. But I'm okay because that's not my responsibility. I've done what
Mm-hmm.
I need to do, and I'm free in the Lord to be kind to them and to be gracious with them, to be with them, and to have no sense of animosity or tension or any negative. There's no negative spirit between us. It's just they've never come and owned their share of the problem. So, but that's, as far as I'm concerned, that's okay.
My understanding of that, if I can, you know, say this, is you're not, you don't have a feeling of attachment to them anymore. Like there's nothing that's that holding together or that feeling of needing something from them, or that's all gone.
Absolutely. And I think
Yeah, that's remarkable.
that's a good word. There's no attachment. There's no sense of obligation or connection uh, that I have with them. But I'm not alienated. I'm not. There's no tension.
Yeah. I had something. So I have a neighbor who lives across the street. She's never really done me wrong in any way, but she reminds me of my mother. And my mother loved me. I loved my mother, but she had her troubles.
Sure.
And so we had our troubles in our relationship. And so this woman across the street reminds me of my mom, and that would make me nervous around her. And so we always seemed to be getting in each other's way. She would take offense to if I had someone come and work on my house. She didn't like that they'd park their truck in front of my house. She lived across the street. She didn't want to look at their truck. So she'd come over and tell me that she didn't want that truck there. And so she had these things that bothered her that were out of my control, but they would still bother me. And I renovated my house a couple of times, actually, 3 times to be exact. It was an old house. It had been built in 1908, and uh, when we first bought this house, the wallpaper was just hanging in pieces off the walls. You know, the glue was gone because it hadn't been renovated since about 1930. And the stairs going down into the basement, in red paint was written danger on the wall, right? Because it was such a steep staircase. And in the basement, they had a pen for animals. And so, I mean, it was there was no electricity on the second floor. So we had to really reconstitute this house from, it was decaying and it was falling apart. So it did take a few times of renovation to put it back into proper shape. But by the time I had it back in proper shape, my neighbor had it with me, and I had kind of had it with her too. But I didn't want to be attached to her. You know, I didn't want to have this. I didn't feel a necessity to be in this kind of relationship with her where there was something between us. So I asked her, I said, what can I do? What can I do for you? I don't want there to be any trouble between us. What can I do to clear the path between us? And so she asked me to write a letter to everybody on the street and give everybody a present of some sort, like a potted plant or something, and say sorry for all of the disruption I'd caused on the street. I said, okay. I said, okay. So I wrote a letter to everybody. I bought everybody a bottle of wine, and I gave everyone that I knew in the vicinity a bottle of wine and a letter. And I gave one to her as well, and she never responded.
Oh, my.
She never responded. Nothing, right? But from that moment on, I didn't feel that kind of attachment anymore. It was as if I'd asked her what I needed to do. She told me what she needed. I gave it to her, and that's all I could do. And I thought it was quite miraculous that after that I wasn't attached to her anymore.
You were free.
I was free. Yeah. Isn't that something, you know? That we can do that for ourselves, you know, that God will help us do that.
That's the power of forgiveness that most people miss, is that it's more for you than for the other person. It frees you.
Yeah.
In some ways it frees them, whether they recognize it or not.
Right. I think that that's true. So that's, yes, forgiveness. I talked with Phyllis.
Yeah. For sure.
I did a podcast with Phyllis, and we concentrated on forgiveness. I think my people got back to me. They really liked that, and I think that it's something that we don't practice in our society often enough, and so people end up in these situations now where they have relationships that aren't healed.
That's exactly right. And Jesus is pretty clear 3 times. He basically says, if you don't forgive, I won't forgive. So when we're not forgiving towards other people, we're in a difficult relationship with Jesus, because there's forgiveness that we're not experiencing that we need from him. So there's a huge issue here. That's why just because I'm, again, the spiritual warfare thing, I like framing it as a weapon. It's a way to destroy the things that destroy relationships. It takes the power out of the hand of Satan to damage us, to damage our relationships, to damage our friends. And so it's a wonderful weapon. And that's the way I think a lot of people ought to look at it. The way to fight to the enemy is to not fight him, but forgive him.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that that's true. So you went off to war, you found Jesus while you were there, like very early on, but then you were in Vietnam. How did that faith sustain you while you were there?
Well, part of the schedule in the war, I mean, it was sometimes all I could do from a spiritual point of view is go to, lay down, go to sleep, and say, "Thank you, Lord, I'm still alive, or made it through this day." There wasn't a lot of Bible studies, or once in a while a chaplain would come by. There wasn't all the normal things, but what I learned was to read the scriptures when I could, and that was a big nourishment. And then there were a lot of friends that were there from the academy and from other resources that fellowship type deals. So whenever I could, would link up with them, and then we'd have a few minutes of fellowship or lunch or something together, pray together. It was a bit of grab and go type thing, but it taught me that a different dynamic to the Lord and the five loaves and the two fishes. It doesn't take a lot to get the job done. So there were these moments almost of fellowship or prayer or reading, but it became something like I've been fed with 5,000 other people. So I
Mm-hmm.
learned, it doesn't take a lot when it's the Lord, the Spirit's doing it. A little becomes a lot when when the circumstances demand it, and those circumstances certainly demanded it. So,
Mm-hmm. And so then after the war, you came back. What did you do after the war was over?
well, it's kind of interesting. This is another one of those things where the hand of the Lord was moving, and I didn't recognize it until many years later. But my role in Vietnam as a combat engineer, we supported the infantry in mines and booby traps, demolitions, in blowing up tunnels, that kind of stuff. And it was a critical military specialty in the early part of the war because most of our casualties were coming from mines and booby traps, that sort of thing. And most of my colleagues, when they finished their deployment, were getting orders to Camp Lejeune or Camp Pendleton, and then 6 months later, they're right back in country. I got orders to headquarters Marine Corps in Washington, D.C. I got pulled out of the war. I was yanked out of it and sent to a staff job for 3 years instead of 6 months. But it was the hand of the Lord because I was still a relatively new believer, but I'd been taught by the Officers Christian Fellowship that when you get to a new duty station, check in with the chapel or local church. In other words, get engaged as soon as you come aboard your new duty station. Well, in Washington, D.C., there are no operating chapels in the military district of Washington. So I wound up going to Fourth Presbyterian Church, which is where Dick Halverson was the senior pastor. That's Chris's dad.
Mm.
And when I was in uniform, when I walked out of the church, Bob Strain, his associate pastor, was a former Marine. And of course, there's this fraternity among guys who wear the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor. And Bob and I became immediate and lifelong friends. And through Bob, I met Dick, and then I met Doug Coe, and I met all the folks supporting the Congress in this thing called the National Prayer Breakfast. So I began to get involved in the prayer breakfast while I was still on active duty. And then after my 3 year time at the headquarters was finished, I was headed back to Vietnam for my second deployment. Had orders in my hand to Commander Naval Forces in Da Nang. Got on an airplane in Washington and flew. When I got to San Francisco, somewhere en route, those orders got changed, and I was sent to Okinawa for a year instead. Came back and I resigned my commission to go to work full time with the prayer breakfast. So I was full time working with Doug Coe and Dick and again the people that helped support the Congress in this thing we call the National Prayer Breakfast. And I did that for a little over 4 years and then went into business from there.
Oh, so you were in the prayer breakfast very early on.
Well, very early on for me, the first prayer breakfast was actually 1953 under when General Eisenhower was president. And it remained a relatively small event the first 4 or 5 years. Maybe there's only 300 or 400 people, but it had started to grow. And by the time I got involved, I'm guessing the ballroom would have 1,500 people in it. And when I left full time, and the last time I went to the breakfast here in DC, there was 3,500 people in the ballroom. So it's grown over the years. Of course, COVID has had a dramatic impact on the ability to gather, and so they're in the process of sort of sorting out how to move forward in a post-COVID world. So that decision is still being worked on.
Have they had any in-person
They
meetings?
haven't had any in-person meetings. The first one in COVID was a totally recorded thing that they did via Zoom. The
Yeah.
second one, they did have a meeting in the visitor center somewhere on Capitol Hill, and it was just for members of Congress only and the president who came. Um, there's some discussion about something similar this year, and then but piping it over to the Hilton Hotel where the main gathering would take place. But that decision is still up in the air. There's no firm decision on that.
What do you think of that? What do you think of that disruption that has come?
Well, when I was involved, the spirit of the breakfast was focused on John chapter 21. Um, when
Mhm.
people think of leadership and servant leadership, particularly they think of Jesus, they'll normally think of John 13 when he washed the disciples' feet. I think of John
Mhm.
21 because the disciples have been out fishing, they hadn't caught anything. John recognizes the Lord is walking on the beach. They come ashore, and the Lord has fixed them breakfast. So here's the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, still serving his men. And he fixed them breakfast. But around that breakfast, they were restored, reconciled, and recalled. Those three things happened because of that breakfast, being around, breaking bread together. And so the spirit of the breakfast was intended to be that Jesus would do the same thing at those tables in the ballroom, that he'd be the present but unseen guest, and that he would recall and restore and reconcile with the people at that table the way he'd done with those first disciples around that fire. Over the years, that kind of spirit has been lost to a great degree. Um, and maybe this is a time that this will be restored, that the true spirit of the breakfast will again come back because it'll be smaller. However, it turns out it's going to be a smaller venue, and that's what I'm hopeful that we'll see the focus on Jesus of reconciling and restoring and recalling people.
And the people that come, some of my listeners might not know about the prayer breakfast and the spirit of the prayer breakfast. So, who comes to that kind of uh, get together?
Well, the breakfast is hosted by a joint committee in the House and Senate, and the invitation list it's by invitation only. But there are representatives. That's probably the best word. People that we have out in the states that we work through to try to make sure that we get a good representation from each of the states by business sector, by race, by education. We try to make this for all people.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just a who's who that gets invited to this thing. And we have a lot of international guests that come. There's a big focus on folks coming from overseas. That's been a particular problem until the one coming. It's been hard to get into the country without a vaccination and other compliance issues that the State Department has imposed. So we're waiting to see how that actually unfolds for this next breakfast.
Mm, yes, because other things like that are happening, where people aren't meeting. If you don't meet together, I mean, we're meeting on Zoom, and that's not too bad, right? That's not too bad, but there's really something about being together in person, don't you think?
Well, absolutely. I mean, our dinner in Washington when you guys were here was it was totally different. You know, breaking bread is a
Yeah.
significant issue in the kingdom, and I think it's underestimated. I think the power of hospitality is woefully underestimated when it comes to kingdom values. Breaking bread around the table is just whether it's the Last Supper or the first breakfast or the feeding of the 5,000. I mean, there's like 30 some incidences where Jesus mixed meals and ministry. And we got in trouble over food and we're headed to a banquet. So somehow this table is meant to be significant in what it means to follow Jesus.
Mm-hmm. And that's very interesting when you look at um, the family these days and how often people eat at home at the dining room table, and how that has been a staple to our family for centuries. And now people are eating out. They're still, if they eat out, they might eat at a table, but often they're catching a meal on their way. And so that time of being together at the table is not as constant as it was.
That's
So
that's absolutely huge. And
I think it might be, yeah.
I personally believe that, Solomon tells us there's a season to everything. Time to born, a time to die, a plant to harvest. He tells us in Ecclesiastes there's a season. I think the season for stadium events like Billy Graham's Crusades or Promise Keepers, I think that season is over. I think the season for the mega church is possibly over as well, these big, huge gatherings. But I think it's a season, it's always been the season for hospitality, having a meal, sharing a meal, and particularly with people in your neighborhood, your community. I think we're going to go back
Mm.
to the person that lives next door, across the street. Just what you did was as much the gospel as anything I know of how you relate to that person across the street or the person next door. And people are lonely, and we don't reach out. But I think that's the season that's here, where we need to do that from a relationship basis. We need to get to know our neighbors, serve our neighbors, care for our neighbors, and that neighbor means literally the person next door.
Yeah, well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because we've been talking about global. Everything has been global. You know, it's been uh, global financing, global environmentalism. Everything has been global, and these things are not what we thought they might be.
Absolutely.
And so, right, that idea of coming back to the local again, back to the local to bring it, to bring clarity, to bring uh, to bring focus, right? Because you can see it when it's closer.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That sounds like it is something that's, well, it's certainly being talked about and planned. Those things are being talked about and planned, I believe.
I think there is a new movement because people are recognizing the loneliness that is out there. It's just
Mm.
staggering, the number of lonely people out there. And I think that's a huge opportunity for those of us who are people of faith, who are following Jesus, to recognize that his call is to love our neighbor. And that's relationship. That's reaching out. That's walking across the fence line. It's going across the street. And I think we're going to find unique opportunities to care for people, to serve people, to help people. And that's wherever we do that, I think we help establish a little piece of the kingdom. That's where we make a difference. And that
Mm-hmm.
difference, I call that difference the kingdom.
Yes. So say now you've been to the war, you're home, you've joined the prayer breakfast, now you've gone to work. What did you decide to go to work in?
Well, it's been a journey. Uh, I went through an assessment program when I got out of the Marine Corps called System for Identifying Motivated Abilities, SIMA, uh, that
Mm-hmm.
helped me understand kind of who I am. And part of what I do, the way I'm wired, is connecting, sales, marketing, those kinds of things. So I've been in real estate securities sales since 1981. And it's a growth. I've sold different things. I've been involved in raising capital for different things. All of them have been a learning experience. And that's kind of what I'm doing today. I'm trying to help people do a better job of managing their investment real estate so that they can uh, not have to pay all the capital gains taxes and other taxes when they sell their property. Because people are getting older, they don't want to manage real estate anymore. They don't want to be involved with tenants and landlord issues and liabilities and insurance and all that stuff. But they don't want to pay the taxes. And so that's part of the strategy that I've developed, is how to help people stay in real estate but not have all those tenant active responsibilities.
Hmm. Yeah, my dad was he was a telegrapher on the Northern Alberta Railway when I was little. I'm the youngest of four kids, so they traveled around. He was a relief agent in the summer when agents went on holidays. He would take over their post, and he knew Morse code, and he would talk to the incoming trains, and that was his job. So I was born really in a train station, in a little town that had just a train station and a cafe. There wasn't much there. But eventually they closed the Northern Alberta Railway, and he had four children. And so he stopped in Northern Alberta and he bought an insurance and real estate company. And so then I was only 6 years old when he settled down. And so my childhood was, my dad was the real estate company, an insurance company for houses and cars the whole time I grew up.
Uh,
And he knew everybody. He was the guy that you came to, so he knew everyone. He was a very friendly fella. I think my dad. I actually my dad's 91 this year, and I went to visit him not very long ago. And some realization I had recently was whenever my dad came to the table, he usually came to the table with a joke. He was always making everybody laugh. And I didn't recognize until very recently that my dad was bringing God to the table because he was very playful. And I know that there's written in scripture a lot about play and how important it is that we have to come to Jesus as children, right?
yep.
And so I think that has to do with being playful and innocent in our play. And I think my dad brought that to the table. And anyway, I got to go tell him that I knew that. I don't think his memory's very good anymore, but I got to tell him that I was very grateful to him that he brought God to the table at night.
Mm.
And I think he was surprised to hear that I said that, but it was good to tell him.
The humanity of Jesus, like humor and tiredness, I mean, it has been lost to a great degree until I watched this program called The Chosen. I don't know
Uh huh.
if you've seen that, but that has done
I haven't. I've heard of it though. I haven't watched it yet.
well. I would encourage it because the guy that put this together, I think, really captured the humanity of Jesus in the context
Mm.
of who he was as the king. It's been a very encouraging thing to me to watch just and ponder the human side of Jesus, of which humor would be an enormous part of that.
Where did you find that program? Was it what platform was it on?
It's on YouTube, or they have a
Oh, it's on YouTube.
on website. They have their own website. Um,
Mm.
and I got somebody saw it and they told me about it, and encouraged me to watch it. So I did. As soon as I watched it, I got hooked on it. They've gone through 2 seasons. They're getting ready to finish up their third season. Uh,
Oh,
and
I thought it was a movie, but it's a series.
it's a series. There's uh, eight sections in each of the first 2 seasons. So they're
Oh,
about
okay.
45 to 50 minutes each. And I think you'd be very encouraged to watch it because it at
But
least for me it's been very powerful about the humanity of Jesus.
you're the second person who's told me who's brought this to me, so I think it's time I watched it.
I'll be interested in what you think of it after you've had a chance to take it in.
Yeah. Well, my other friend too. She's very. She thinks that it's great, and I think the first time she told me about it was a year ago, but she mentioned it to me again a couple of days ago, and so now you're mentioning it to me. I'm like, okay, I hear, I can hear.
For
Yeah,
sure.
that's for sure. So, did you get married and have a family?
I'm married, yes. My former wife was a Marine Corps widow. She had 3 children. Her husband had been in my company at the Naval Academy. We'd actually double dated when we were midshipmen. He was sadly killed in a training accident. He was a fighter pilot in the
Mm-hmm.
Corps. Um, it was a training accident, and he was killed. And we got married a year after he had died. And um, but the marriage didn't last. So I've been divorced for 20 some years now, almost 25 years, and we had 3 girls that came with the marriage. Then we added a boy and a girl.
Mm.
My
Oh wow, 5 kids.
five kiddos. My
Mm-hmm.
son, it's kind of some people laugh about this. All the time he was growing up, he'd come to me and say, "Dad, I'm going to go to Navy and play lacrosse. You know, what do you think?" Because he was macho type stuff. And any little kid, he'd start up, got in high school. I'm going to go to Navy and play lacrosse. I couldn't tell whether that was the son wanting to please his dad or whether it was really his heart that he wanted to go to Navy. At that time, my next door neighbor was a All-American lacrosse player from West Point. So I called him and said, "Look, why don't you have the coach come down, take a look at him, see if maybe they'd be interested." Well, they did. They sent a coach down, watched him play lacrosse, and said, "Yeah, we'd like to talk to him." So In January of 1995, we drove up to West Point, and he didn't really want to go because he said, "I'm going to go to the Navy and play lacrosse." And I said, "Well, son, these kind of decisions, more information is always better than less. What do you got to lose?" So we go up to West Point, January '95. I don't know if you've ever been in that part of the world in winter, but it's gray. The road's gray, the landscape is gray, the river's gray, the buildings are gray. You get on post in the uniform, everything's gray. So I was so glad I didn't go there. But anyway, went through the weekend and we're driving off post, and I look over to the passenger seat, and I can tell that my son's heart has been grabbed by what he had experienced that weekend. And a week, 10 days later, he comes to me and says, "Dad, can I talk to you?" I said, "Well, sure, what's up?" And we went to West Point. He just mumbled until he could get out, "Dad, what would you think if I went to West Point?" And I'm looking in his eyes, and I'm looking in the eyes of a young man fearful of disappointing his father. So I just grabbed him, gave him a big hug, and told him I thought it'd be a great idea. And today he's a full colonel. He's in Africa now.
Wow.
Significant responsibilities over there. He's married, got 3 kids. He's really he's really something to do. He's someone that I'm very proud of because of what he's accomplished and who he is. So
No,
yeah.
congratulations.
So he went over the dark
What did
side. Yeah.
Yeah. So what did you think? You'd been to war, and now he was going and joining the army. What was that like for you?
Well, it was a different experience because he had 4 deployments to Afghanistan before he took this thing in Africa. And now I'm on the parental side and experiencing what my parents experienced when I was over there. When I was there, every night was filled with the news of the war. So they were being constantly bombarded with the battles and stuff on TV. The Afghan war, we hardly ever saw anything about that on the news media. But
Right.
I knew kind of the things that he was up to and would be involved in. So it really, I really prayed a lot because I knew the danger that he was going to be involved in, and certainly there were times when that prayer got answered.
Yeah. That's even small things, day-to-day things that will upset me. If I pray through them, I'm always taken care of.
Mm.
It comes out some way that it's supposed to come out that I didn't think up, that I wouldn't have thought up. And it's fine the way it is. And I couldn't have planned it better.
Sure.
But that's taken me a long time to learn to do that, to turn to prayer right away so that I'm not fretting, worrying, planning, trying to manipulate, any of those things. I don't want to do any of those things. Uh, I've done that enough in my life. I know it doesn't work. And so, but this does seem to work. This really does seem to work because I have a lot less conflict and strife in my life if I just pray and see what the next right thing is to do.
Right.
It's just so much easier. So I can't believe how grateful I feel now that I've learned to put myself back in the seat and let somebody else, like God, take the steering wheel. Right? I'll sit in the back seat. No longer in the driver's seat. And it's been good for me, so good for me. And I think my husband is also, he told me today, actually, uh, that being with me is easy, it's easy, and it's, and I feel solid to him. So and that's good, because he's going all kinds of places, and I need to be supportive.
Sure. Absolutely.
And I've also learned that I used to think, we all are taught in school and by society who we ought to be and what we ought to do and how we ought to think, but the time that I spent being married and trying to run the show myself, and now comparing that to sitting in the back seat and letting God have the steering wheel and just doing the next right thing that I can find, my life is running so much better, and I feel like I'm so much more help now Here I was trying to help all the time, and my help wasn't as effective as it is now.
Sure.
Ah, yeah. It's so refreshing. It's so refreshing.
When it's not, what you're saying resonates with me in a special way because when I was at the academy and in the Marine Corps, I was taught to fix things or die trying. You fix things, you solve problems. And as I've gotten older and realized there's a lot of things I can't fix, and that has put me into a whole new learning curve of what it means to trust the Lord. We all know from the Gospel of John that the work of God is to believe, but I'm discovering through a devotional I was reading that the hard work of God is to trust. And so moving
Mm,
in the back seat is an expression of trust that he's got the wheel, he knows where he's going, he's got a plan, and we can trust that. And
mm-hmm.
this is a whole new experience for me. By the way, when we had dinner, one of the books I told you I was going to send you is this book, Prayer in the Night, I think,
Okay.
by Tish Harrison Warren. It's
Mm-hmm.
for those who work or watch or weep, and it's one of my best reads so far this year on these very issues that we're talking about. So I'll this will be in Canada waiting for you when you get home.
Oh, thank you, John. Thank you. I I've been reading I've been reading anti-feminist books. Well, I've been wondering, what am I doing on this podcast? I'm talking to interesting people, and but and I'm just doing it. I don't know exactly why. I'm curious. That's about as much as I can explain. I don't really know anything in particular, but I'm starting to understand. I think that there's some work that I need to do with women, and that us women, we have to speak up and share our knowledge, what we've learned, and the mistakes we've made, because these young people need to know the journeys we've been through. So that's kind of what I've been doing, is reading some of these kind of books, and learning a lot, because I never studied anything about feminism. I studied sciences in university. I stayed away from I stayed away from feminism, but now I'm going to read about it, and I'm going to read some people who are writing about some deep understanding of what's gone on since 1750, and since we've got the vote, and since we've gone to work, and since we've been on the birth control pill, and all of these things have changed women so much. And you were talking about the kitchen table and breaking bread together, and that was one of the main things that women have done through the centuries, is brought the bread to the table. And I think we need to do that again.
It's interesting that you'd be concerned or have a focus on women. A couple of thoughts coming out of this spiritual warfare framework that I've been working on. A couple of things that I would like to be a voice for is woman was the final creation of the Lord. And I would say that as the final creation, it's his greatest expression of his creativity. A woman is sort of the crown, a crowning achievement, the crown of all creation. And I think a lot of women don't understand that or don't appreciate that, don't
Mm,
function out of that because that crown, coming with that crown, is a special glory that's theirs and theirs alone. And the second thing is in the Hebrew, it says he formed Adam, but he fashioned Eve. It's a different Hebrew word. And the Hebrew word for fashioning is more complex, more intentional, more construction, more going on, which in one sense you'd say, well, that makes a lot of sense. It's easier to work with a malleable piece of clay than a rigid piece of calcium. But I think as God
mm,
was fashioning Eve to present her to Adam, he was thinking downrange of the time when he'll present the church to the second Adam. And so that's another unique glory that woman has as being a representation of the bride of Christ. And then I was just reading last night again how wisdom in the book of Proverbs is characterized as feminine. It's a female voice that speaks to wisdom. And those are wonderful things to give glory that belong to women. And I think they belong to women alone. They don't belong to us guys. So I'd certainly encourage you in any efforts that you're doing to reach out to women to recapture or to claim this glory that's rightfully theirs.
That's beautiful. And yes, I think that it's up to us to dig deep and find out what is best to bring forward.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
And we mentioned setting the table. I think every time a woman or a man, but whenever the table is set, it should be that day's reminder of the banquet that's being prepared for us at the wedding feast of the Lamb. So there's a setting the table is not just some routine chore that has to be done. It's a precursor to something that's coming.
Right. So the whole idea of hosting is it's not about how clean your house is. It's about how welcoming your house is. Right?
Exactly. Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop.
Okay. I'm with you. So
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, John. It
oh
was so nice to talk to you. We haven't spent this much time talking, so that was really lovely.
yeah, well, thank you. And anything I can do to be of help in the future, just let me know. And I got
Oh, I will.
a couple of these books will be coming to you. One of which
Okay.
is called "The Gospel Comes with a House Key," and this is by Rosaria Butterfield. I don't know if you know that name, but
No.
she's a very.
Is it about the Gospels?
It's about the
It's
gospel. This lady
oh boy.
was a professor of English, I think, at Syracuse University, but she was also a feminist, lesbian, living with a partner, and Promise Keepers came to Syracuse, and she wrote a scathing article of just really ripping these misogynists and negative toward men. And that article was given to Ken Smith, who was a pastor in Syracuse, and he just wrote her a pretty winsome letter, just asking questions about how she got to this conclusion, sort of thing. And then he concluded his letter by inviting her to dinner, to come to his house and have dinner with he and his wife. And I can send you the interview, but she turned it down, or she went. And she says in the interview, after 500 meals, she came to faith in Jesus. And she's now married to a pastor. They have a church down in Raleigh, North Carolina. She's doing a phenomenal work. It's an amazing story. But she wrote this book, "The Gospel Comes with a House Key." It's all about hospitality. And
oh wow, that sounds like a fascinating story.
and I'll say the C.S. Lewis Institute they interviewed her and Ken Smith. Ken's wife Floyd had passed away, but they had this, and I'll send you the interview. You can look at it. And if you get into this whole issue of feminism, I think reading some of her material, maybe even reaching out to her I think you'd find it really helpful.
Okay. Sure. Well, thank you for that. That's great.
Wonderful. Well, enjoy Europe and say hi to Jordan. And
oh, I will.
We've got you guys in our prayers.
Thank you very much, and that's much appreciated. We're doing very well, by the way. So.
Good. Well, we'll look forward to having you back in Washington and getting together again.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm seeing Chris and Phyllis in Europe soon.
I'm not aware of their schedule, so it's entirely possible because they're all over.
I think so. Well, I'm not entirely sure either, but I think so.
Okay. Well, it'll be good if you can.
It'll be good if I can. That's for sure. Okay.
All right. Wonderful.
Thanks a lot.